There is a single word spoken by an elder in the Yukon territory of northern Canada, and the exact same word spoken 2,000 miles away by a grandmother in the Navajo Nation of Arizona. Same meaning, same sound, same root, two peoples, two continents apart, no contact for centuries. How is that possible? That's not a coincidence, that's not a borrowing, that's a fingerprint, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Today we're going to follow that fingerprint, through frozen tundra, across mountain passes, deep into desert canyons, and find out what it tells us about one of the most remarkable migrations in human history. A story that mainstream history textbooks still haven't fully absorbed. A story written in language, in DNA, in the shape of a verb. The story of the Dene. Let's start with a problem. Most people, when they think about North America's indigenous peoples, imagine something static. Tribes in their places. Cultures rooted in their landscapes since the beginning of time. The Apache in the southwest, the Navajo in the Canyon Country, the various Athabaskan nations spread across Alaska and the Yukon. That picture is wrong. Or rather, it's incomplete in a way that matters enormously. Because roughly 1,000 years ago, something moved. Something big. Something organized. Something that carried an entire language system, an entire way of reading the world, from the subarctic forests of northwestern Canada all the way down to the deserts of the American Southwest. And we know this not because someone wrote it down. Nobody wrote it down. We know it because the language itself survived. Here's what linguists discovered, and it took them over 200 years to fully accept it. The Navajo language and the various Athabaskan languages of Canada and Alaska belong to the same family. Not distantly, not vaguely, closely, structurally, in ways that go far beyond shared vocabulary. The technical term is Na-Dene, a language grouping that today includes roughly 40 different languages, spread across an area of North America that covers more geographic ground than all of Western Europe. You have the Dene peoples of the Northwest Territories and Yukon, the Twacho, the Dene Thar, the Yellowknives, the Chippewayan, and dozens more. You have the various Athabaskan groups of Alaska and British Columbia. And then, thousands of miles to the south, seemingly disconnected from all of it, you have the Navajo, who call themselves Dene, and the Apache, who belong to the same linguistic branch. Dene, Dene. One word, two worlds. When Edward Sapir, one of the greatest linguists of the 20th century, first formally proposed the Na-Dene classification in 1923, the academic world was skeptical. The geographic spread was too vast. The cultural differences seemed too great. How could the same people, the same language, exist both in the frozen north and in the scorching desert south? Sapir was right, and the proof came from multiple directions at once. Let's talk about what makes this connection so strange, so specific. Languages drift, everyone knows this. Latin became French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese. And these languages, while related, are quite different today. The drift takes centuries, and it accelerates when peoples separate and lose contact. The Na-Dene languages show exactly this kind of drift. Navajo and, say, the Dene languages of the Yukon are not mutually intelligible. You couldn't walk from one community to the other and just start talking. The separation has been long enough, the distance great enough, that the languages have evolved distinctly. But the underlying structure, the bones of the language, identical. And this matters, because language structure, the deep grammar, the way verbs work, the way sentences are built, that doesn't get borrowed. You don't absorb grammar from your neighbors the way you absorb vocabulary. Grammar is inherited. Grammar travels with people. Navajo verbs are among the most complex in any language on Earth. A single Navajo verb can encode information that English would need an entire sentence to express. The shape of an object, whether it's moving or stationary, the direction of motion, the relationship between subject and object, the time frame, the certainty of the speaker. It is a staggeringly sophisticated system. And that same system, structurally, architecturally, exists in the Athabaskan languages of the Canadian North. You don't get that by accident. You don't get that by trade. You get that by descent. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. If the Navajo and the northern Dene peoples are related, if they share a common ancestor, then when did they separate? When did the Great Southern Migration happen? For a long time, archaeologists said, impossible to know. The Navajo oral traditions speak of emerging from a series of underworlds, of long migrations, of arriving in the southwest from the north. Scholars long dismissed this as mythology. They shouldn't have, because the archaeological record eventually started telling the same story the oral traditions had been telling all along. The Navajo and Apache are newcomers to the American Southwest, not ancient inhabitants, newcomers. The Pueblo peoples, the Hopi, the Zuni, they have been in the region for thousands of years. The Navajo arrived later, much later. The best current estimates, drawn from linguistics, archaeology, and DNA analysis together, place the southward migration of the ancestral Navajo and Apache somewhere between 800 and 1,000 years ago, around the year 1000 to 1200 of the Common Era. That's not ancient, that's medieval. In European terms, that's the age of the Crusades. That's the age of Genghis Khan. That's yesterday, in human history terms. A people moved. Within living cultural memory, almost. And they moved far. Think about what that migration looked like. You are leaving the boreal forest. You know cold. You know spruce trees, caribou, frozen rivers, long dark winters. Your entire cultural toolkit is built for that environment. And now you are walking south, first through the Rocky Mountain corridors, the eastern slopes, threading through passes, following rivers. The landscape changing around you, forests thinning, grasslands opening up, then the high desert plateaus, then the canyon country, the red rock, the heat. Everything you knew about survival, rethought. Every plant, every animal, every seasonal pattern, new. And yet the people made it. They didn't just survive the migration, they thrived. They became the Diné. They built one of the most resilient cultures in North American history. What did they carry with them that survived the transformation? Language. That was the core. The language was the container for everything else, the worldview, the relationships, the way of categorizing reality. Strip away the specific plants and animals and landscapes, and what remains is the deep structure. The grammar of existence. That grammar survived 2,000 miles of migration and 1,000 years of separation. Here's something that most people don't know. The Na-Dene language family might extend even further than North America. In 1998, linguist Joseph Greenberg proposed a connection between Na-Dene and a language isolate spoken in the Caucasus Mountains of southern Russia. More recently, other researchers have explored potential connections to Yeniseian languages in Siberia. The Yeniseian connection, in particular, has gained real traction. Linguist Edward Vida, working in the 2000s, demonstrated a systematic sound correspondence between the extinct Ket language of Central Siberia and the Athabaskan languages of North America. This was not a fringe claim. It was peer-reviewed, published in established journals, and accepted by most specialists in the field. What does that mean? It means the Na-Dene story might not begin in North America at all. It might begin in Siberia. In a migration across Beringia, the land bridge that connected Asia and America during the last ice age, that happened separately from the migrations that brought other Native American populations to the continent. Most Native Americans descend from a single founding population that crossed from Siberia roughly 16,000 years ago. But the Na-Dene peoples might represent a second wave, a later wave, a distinct group that came across with a distinct language system and then spread across a continent. Two migrations, two waves of humanity crossing the same frozen bridge thousands of years apart. We are only at the beginning of this story. We've established that the Dean of northern Canada and the Navajo of the American Southwest are linguistically connected. We've established that this connection is deep, structural, and real, not a coincidence, not a borrowing. We've established that the separation happened roughly 1,000 years ago, in a southward migration that is now supported by archaeology, linguistics, and DNA. And we've opened a door into something even larger, the possibility that the Na-Dene peoples represent a distinct wave of human migration into the Americas, one that ties them not just to each other across 2,000 miles of North American landscape, but potentially to a population in Siberia that no longer exists. There is a word that the Dene elders of the Yukon use for themselves, And the Navajo grandmothers in Arizona use the same word, dene, dine, the people. They are right, they are the same people, separated by time, by distance, by desert and forest and mountain. But the same people. Language is a clue, but DNA is a confession. Language can be borrowed. Language can spread through trade, through intermarriage, through conquest. A word travels light. It doesn't need to carry a body with it. DNA is different. DNA doesn't lie. DNA doesn't travel without a person attached to it. When you find the same genetic signature in two populations separated by 2,000 miles and 1,000 years, that's not a coincidence. That's a family reunion. And when geneticists started looking at the Dean peoples of northern Canada and the Navajo and Apache of the American Southwest, what they found confirmed everything the linguists had suspected, and then went further, much further. Let's back up to the beginning, the very beginning. Roughly 20,000 years ago, the world was in the grip of the last glacial maximum. Ice sheets covered enormous portions of the northern hemisphere. Sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today, in some places by as much as 400 feet. That drop in sea level exposed a landmass between what is now Siberia and what is now Alaska. Scholars call it Beringia. It wasn't a narrow bridge. It was a vast, flat, relatively hospitable grassland, wider than the state of Texas, stretching across what is now the Bering Strait. People lived there. For thousands of years, populations settled in Beringia, neither fully in Asia nor fully in America. They hunted mammoth and steppe bison on the open grassland. They fished the rivers. They adapted to an extreme environment, cold, wind-blasted, treeless in places but rich in game. And then, as the ice began to retreat and the land bridge began to flood, they moved. Most of them moved east, into the Americas, down through ice-free corridors, along coastlines, spreading across a continent that no human had ever set foot on. This is the founding population of the Americas. Most Native American peoples, from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego, descend from this group. The genetic signature of that original migration is ancient, distinct, and remarkably consistent across thousands of miles and dozens of cultures. But there is a complication. Not everyone fit the pattern. When geneticists started sequencing ancient DNA from archaeological sites across North America, most samples lined up exactly as expected, descendants of that founding Beringian population, arriving roughly 15 to 16,000 years ago. But certain populations showed something different. The Na-Dene peoples, the Athabaskan groups of Canada and Alaska, and their relatives the Navajo and Apache in the Southwest, carried a genetic signature that didn't quite match the others. It wasn't radically different. These were still clearly Native American populations, still descended from Beringian ancestors. But the proportions were off. The specific lineages within the overall Native American genetic tree were distinct. It looked genetically like a second migration, not a replacement. The Na-Dene peoples are not genetically alien to other Native Americans, but a separate wave, a distinct founding event, arriving later, bringing its own mix of lineages, its own genetic emphasis, from a Beringian or Siberian source population that had evolved somewhat differently from the one that generated the first migration. This hypothesis, the second wave hypothesis, has been building in the genetic literature since the early 2000s. A landmark 2012 study used genome-wide data from dozens of Native American populations and found statistically significant support for the idea that Na-Dene peoples represent a distinct migration event. The language data and the genetic data were pointing at the same thing, from opposite directions. Now let's get specific about what the DNA actually shows. The Y chromosome, the genetic material passed from father to son, is particularly useful for tracing migrations because it doesn't recombine. It passes essentially intact from generation to generation, accumulating small mutations that act as markers, as timestamps. Among the Athabaskan peoples of Canada and Alaska, and among the Navajo and Apache, certain Y chromosome lineages appear at strikingly high frequencies, lineages that connect more specifically to a Siberian source population, not the same Siberian source that generated the first migration. A somewhat different one. This isn't absolute. Populations mix, boundaries blur. The Navajo, in particular, show evidence of genetic admixture with Pueblo peoples they encountered in the southwest, and the northern Athabaskan groups show admixture with Arctic populations, with coastal peoples, with neighbors encountered along thousands of years of coexistence. But underneath that mixing, the signal remains. The Nardene peoples carry a genetic heritage that is, in measurable ways, distinct from that of their geographic neighbors, and shared with each other across 2,000 miles of separation. The Diné elder in the Yukon and the Navajo grandmother in Arizona are not just speaking related languages. They are, in a meaningful genetic sense, family. Here's where it gets strange. Remember the Yeniseian connection, the linguistic link between Athabaskan languages and the Ket language of Siberia. The genetics followed. The Ket people of central Siberia, a tiny population, today numbering fewer than 1,000 individuals, living along the Yenisei River in what is now Russia, show a genetic profile that is closer to Nardene populations of North America than to any of their Siberian neighbors. Let that sink in. A small group of people living in the forests of central Siberia, surrounded by populations that speak entirely different languages and carry different genetic signatures. Those people are genetically closer to the Navajo and the Dene of northern Canada than they are to the Russians or the Turkic peoples living beside them. The Ket are the remnant, the trace in the Old World of a population that largely moved east, crossed Beringia, and became the Nardene peoples of the Americas. That's not a theory, that's genomics. That's published data, peer-reviewed, replicated across multiple independent research groups. The connection that linguists first suspected, that the Nardene language family might have roots reaching back into Siberia, is now confirmed at the genetic level. Two families, separated for perhaps 8 to 10,000 years, one on each side of the Pacific, and they still carry the biological signature of their shared origin. Now let's bring it back to the Navajo migration. Studies of Navajo and Apache DNA consistently show that these populations are more closely related to northern Athabaskan groups than to any of their southwestern neighbors. The Hopi, the Zuni, the various Pueblo peoples who have lived in the region for thousands of years, genetically, they are more distant from the Navajo than the Yukon Diné are. Geography says Navajo and Hopi are neighbors. They share a landscape. DNA says Navajo and Dene are family. They share an ancestry. The migration happened. The DNA confirms it. The language confirms it. And archaeology confirms it too. There is one more genetic thread worth pulling. The mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line, passed from mother to child, tells a slightly different story from the Y chromosome, and that difference is important. The Navajo Y chromosome is overwhelmingly Athabaskan in origin. The paternal line connects north, but the mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line, shows a somewhat higher level of admixture with southwestern populations. Pueblo women, most likely. Women who joined Navajo communities through intermarriage, through adoption, through the complex social dynamics of a migrant group settling into an already inhabited landscape. What does this tell us? It tells us something about how the migration worked. It wasn't a clean displacement. It wasn't warfare followed by replacement. It was messier than that, more human than that. Men arrived, established communities, and over generations integrated with the peoples they encountered. The cultural core, the language, the ceremonial system, the deep structure of the Navajo worldview remained Athabaskan. But the biological population absorbed local women, local lineages, local genetic material. The Navajo became something new, something that was Athabaskan in its bones, but Southwestern in its flesh. And that combination produced one of the most distinctive cultures in North American history. We've now looked at two lines of evidence, language and DNA. Both point in the same direction. Both tell the same story. A population, rooted ultimately in Siberia, crossed into North America in what appears to be a second, distinct migration wave. They spread across the subarctic forests of what is now Canada and Alaska. They became the Dene, the people. And roughly 1,000 years ago, a branch of that population began moving south, following corridors through the Rocky Mountains, crossing the high plateau, arriving finally in the canyon country of the American Southwest, where they became the Diné, which is simply the Navajo pronunciation of the same word. Dene, Dine, the same word, the same people, the same blood. The science has spoken, but science is one language for this story. There is another language, and it has been speaking for a very long time. Before there were universities, there were elders. Before there were journals, there were fires. Before there were genome sequencers and linguistic databases and peer-reviewed studies, there were stories, told in the dark, in winter, when the world was quiet and the children were listening. And those stories remembered things. Things that happened 1,000 years ago. Things that happened 5,000 years ago. Things that science is only now, with all its instruments and its satellites and its billion-dollar sequencing machines, beginning to confirm. The oral traditions of the Dene and the Navajo have been dismissed for generations, called mythology, called legend, filed away under folklore, which is the academic word for we don't take this seriously. They should have taken it seriously. Let's start with the Navajo. The Navajo origin story, the creation narrative that sits at the center of Navajo ceremonial and cultural life, describes a journey through a series of worlds. Not one world, multiple worlds stacked beneath this one, each with its own character, its own challenges, its own lessons. The people moved upward through these worlds. They emerged finally into this world, glittering world, the Navajo call it, through a reed, through an opening, ascending from below. Western scholars for generations called this pure mythology, a cosmological story about spiritual realms, not a historical memory of actual migration. But look at it differently. A people moving upward through a series of increasingly inhabitable environments, through cold, dark, difficult worlds, toward a warmer, brighter, more abundant world at the top. A long journey, multiple stages, emergence into a new landscape through a narrow passage. That is also an accurate poetic description of a migration southward through mountain corridors, from the frozen subarctic, through increasingly temperate zones, through narrow mountain passes, into the sun-drenched plateau country of the southwest. The specific details shift. Mythology always abstracts and elevates the literal into the symbolic. But the underlying structure of the story matches the underlying structure of the migration. A journey upward through worlds. A journey southward through landscapes. The elders were remembering. The story was the container. Now go north, 2,000 miles north, to the Dean peoples of the Northwest Territories, the Yukon, northern British Columbia. They have their own origin stories, their own accounts of where they came from and how they came to be where they are. And those stories, in multiple Dean traditions, speak of a time before, a time when the people lived somewhere else, somewhere to the west, or to the northwest, or across water. A time of great movement, great change, great hardship. These are not stories that say, we have always been here, unchanged, since the beginning of time. These are stories that remember movement, that remember transition, that remember the experience of being people in motion. And what does the genetic data say? The genetic data says these people's ancestors were in motion, crossing Beringia, spreading through the subarctic, moving, always moving. The stories remember the movement. Here is something that should stop you cold. In the Navajo ceremonial system, there is a concept called hojo. It is usually translated as beauty or harmony, but that translation is inadequate. Hojo is a state of balance, of right relationship between all things, of the world being as it should be. Navajo ceremonial life, the chants, the sand paintings, the healing ceremonies, is oriented around restoring Hojo when it has been disturbed. In the Athabaskan traditions of the North, among the Dean peoples of Canada, there are parallel concepts. The idea that human beings exist within a web of relationships with the land, with animals, with the spirit world, and that proper conduct means maintaining balance within that web. The specific vocabulary is different. The specific ceremonies are different. 2,000 miles and 1,000 years of separate development have produced distinct cultural expressions. But the underlying philosophy, the deep architecture of how human beings relate to the world, is recognizably the same. You don't borrow a philosophy, you inherit it. Let's talk about something concrete, something specific. The drum. Both the Northern Dean peoples and the Navajo use a single-headed frame drum in ceremonial contexts. This is not a universal instrument. Many cultures use drums, but the specific form, a round frame, a single membrane, held and struck in particular ways for ceremonial purposes, is a cultural choice, not an inevitability. The similarities in ceremonial drum use across the Nardene world have been noted by ethnomusicologists for over a century. The instrument traveled with the people. The ceremony traveled with the instrument. Or consider the sweat lodge, the purification ceremony conducted in a small, enclosed, steam-filled structure is found across Nardene cultures, both north and south. The specific protocols differ, the prayers differ, the architectural details differ. But the core practice, using heat and steam for physical and spiritual purification in a small enclosed space, as a ceremonial act, is present in both the northern Dean world and in Navajo tradition. These are not coincidences. Cultures that share these practices at this level of structural similarity share a common root. The drum and the sweat lodge traveled south with the people. There is a scholar whose work deserves attention here. Keith Basso was an anthropologist who spent decades working with the Western Apache, one of the southern Athabaskan peoples related to the Navajo. His book, Wisdom Sits in Places, explored something that had largely been ignored by mainstream scholarship: place names. The Apache, Basso discovered, had an extraordinarily rich system of place names, names that encoded specific moral stories, specific historical memories, specific lessons about how to live. A place name wasn't just a label for geographic orientation, it was a compressed moral narrative. Speaking the name of a place invoked the story attached to it, and the story taught something. This relationship between landscape, language, and moral memory is found throughout Nardene cultures. The Dene peoples of the north have it. The Navajo have it. The Apache have it. You cannot separate the people from the land they name, because the naming is the knowing, and the knowing is the inheritance. When the ancestral Navajo migrated south, they began naming a new landscape, building a new system of moral geography in a new place, taking the practice, the deep habit of reading the land through story, with them and applying it to canyon walls and desert rivers they had never seen before. The practice survived the migration. The land changed. The practice didn't. Now I want to talk about something the oral traditions preserved that archaeology is only now confirming. Multiple Dene traditions in the north speak of a time of great cold, a time when the world was different, when glaciers covered the land, when survival required constant movement. This is not a vague spiritual metaphor. This is a specific environmental memory, a memory of the Ice Age, of the conditions that shaped Beringian life for thousands of years before the migration into the Americas. For a long time, scholars assumed that oral traditions couldn't reliably preserve information over more than a few hundred years. The thinking was, after a few generations, stories drift too much to be trusted as historical documents. That assumption has been overturned. Research published in recent decades has demonstrated that some oral traditions preserve accurate information over astonishing timescales. Australian Aboriginal traditions, for example, have been shown to contain accurate memories of coastal geography that was last above water over 7,000 years ago, confirmed by modern geological surveys. If oral tradition can preserve 7,000-year-old geographic memories in Australia, there is no reason to assume that Dene traditions cannot preserve memories of Ice Age conditions that shaped their ancestors' lives in Beringia. The elders knew. They have always known. The stories were the archive. Here's what I find most remarkable about this entire story. Modern science, genomics, computational linguistics, archaeology, has spent roughly 100 years catching up to what the oral traditions already contained. The linguists confirmed the connection in the 1920s. The geneticists confirmed it in the 2000s. The archaeologists are still filling in the details of the migration route. But the Navajo already knew they came from the north. Their stories say so. The elders said so. The Dene already knew they were part of a larger people, connected to others across distance and time. Their traditions say so. Science didn't discover the truth. Science confirmed what the people already knew. That's worth sitting with. That's worth taking seriously. In a world that constantly privileges the written over the spoken, the laboratory over the campfire, the journal article over the elder's voice. This story is a correction. The knowledge was there, in the language, in the ceremony, in the drum and the sweat lodge, and the way of naming a mountain or a river. The knowledge survived everything. Survived the migration south, survived the centuries of separation, survived colonization, boarding schools, forced assimilation, the systematic attempt to erase precisely this kind of knowing. It survived. People leave things behind. That's the fundamental premise of archaeology. Every campfire, every discarded tool, every burial, every hearth, each one is a message from the past. An unintentional message. Nobody camped by a river 1,000 years ago thinking, someday someone will dig this up and read it. But we do. We dig. We read. And when archaeologists started looking for the physical evidence of the Athabaskan southward migration, the trail left by the ancestors of the Navajo as they moved from the subarctic forests of Canada down into the canyon country of the American Southwest, they found it. It wasn't easy to find. It took decades of careful work across thousands of miles of terrain, piecing together fragments from dozens of sites. But the trail is there, and it tells a story that matches, detail by detail, what the linguists and the geneticists and the oral traditions had already suggested. Let's start in the north. The archaeological signature of Athabaskan peoples in the subarctic has been studied since the mid-20th century. Certain tools, certain ways of making tools, certain patterns in how campsites are organized, certain burial practices. One of the most diagnostic items is something called the microblade tradition. Small, precisely crafted stone blades, made in a very specific technical way, used as components of composite tools, knives, projectile points, scrapers, where the small blade is hafted into a handle or shaft. This technology has a distribution. It appears in Siberia. It appears in Beringia. It appears in Alaska and the Yukon. And as you trace it southward, you can follow it, like breadcrumbs, down through British Columbia, through the interior plateau, into the Rocky Mountain corridors. The microblades themselves change over time. Technology always evolves. But the tradition, the underlying approach to stoneworking, persists. And it persists specifically in sites associated with Athabaskan peoples. The tools were moving south. Now let's jump forward in time, to the southwest, to where the Navajo and Apache appear in the archaeological record. Here's what's striking. The earliest unambiguous Navajo and Apache sites in the southwest, sites that can be definitively associated with these peoples based on their distinctive material culture, their ceramic styles, their architectural patterns, date to roughly the 14th and 15th centuries of the Common Era. But there's an earlier layer, a more ambiguous layer. Sites that show Athabaskan-associated material culture appearing in the archaeological record of the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountain foothills somewhat earlier, perhaps as far back as the 12th or 13th century. This matches the linguistic and genetic estimates of when the migration happened. And critically, these early sites show a people in transition, a subarctic culture adapting in real time to a completely different environment. The early Navajo archaeological sites don't look like fully formed southwestern culture. They look like a northern people working out how to live in the south. The adaptation is visible in the ground. Let's be specific about what archaeologists have found. The early Navajo, archaeologists sometimes call them ancestral Apachean or Proto-Navajo, show a very distinctive pattern. They were mobile, highly mobile. Subarctic peoples are adapted to mobility, following game, following seasonal resources, moving camp regularly. This was their inherited strategy, and they brought it south. The early sites are small, temporary, shallow in their deposits, meaning people didn't stay long. The structures, where there are structures at all, are simple. The forerunners of the Hogan, the traditional Navajo dwelling, which is itself a simplified, adapted version of subarctic dwelling forms. Compare this to the Pueblo peoples, who had been in the southwest for thousands of years. Pueblo sites are deep, layered, multi-generational, massive stone architecture, kivas, plazas. These are the remains of people who stayed. The early Navajo sites say, "We are moving through. We are still learning this place." That contrast between the deep-rooted Pueblo archaeological record and the mobile, shallow, early Navajo record is one of the clearest pieces of evidence for the migration. It is the archaeological signature of a people who recently arrived. There is one archaeological find that deserves special attention. In the 1980s and 90s, researchers working in the Canadian subarctic and in the American Northwest began comparing specific artifact types across enormous geographic distances. One of the most telling comparisons involved a particular style of projectile point, an arrowhead, found in Athabaskan sites across the north. When comparable points were found in early Apache and Navajo sites in the southwest, the similarity was unmistakable. Not identical, 1,000 miles and several centuries of independent development had produced variation. But the underlying design philosophy, the specific angles and proportions and hafting conventions, these were recognizably related. The arrowhead that an Athabaskan hunter was using in the Yukon in the 11th century had a cousin in the southwest 2 centuries later. That's not coincidence, that's inheritance. Now I want to talk about what the Navajo did when they arrived. Because here's something important. The migration wasn't just survival. It wasn't just a desperate people fleeing difficult conditions and somehow stumbling into the southwest. The ancestral Navajo were extraordinarily adaptive, extraordinarily intelligent in their response to a new environment. When they arrived in the southwest, they encountered a landscape and a set of cultures unlike anything in their northern experience. The Pueblo peoples, sophisticated, settled, with centuries of accumulated knowledge about desert farming, water management, ceramic production, architectural construction, were already there. What did the Navajo do? They learned. The archaeological record shows over the course of several centuries a gradual incorporation of southwestern cultural elements into the Navajo cultural toolkit. Ceramic production, the Navajo began making pottery, adopting and adapting Pueblo techniques. Agriculture, the Navajo began farming corn and squash and beans, the classic southwestern triad, learning from their Pueblo neighbors. Architecture, the Hogan evolved, incorporating elements drawn from the broader southwestern building tradition. But, and this is crucial, the Navajo did not become Pueblo. They integrated new knowledge into an existing framework. The deep structure remained Athabaskan. The language remained Na-Dene. The ceremonial system retained its northern roots even as it incorporated new elements. The Navajo became something unprecedented, something that had never existed before. A northern people, resettled in the south, who had absorbed the best of what the south had to offer while preserving the essential inheritance of the north. That synthesis is the Navajo Nation. That synthesis produced one of the most sophisticated indigenous cultures in North American history. Here's where we need to talk about something that happened much later, something that tested everything: the Long Walk. In 1863 and 1864, the United States Army conducted a systematic campaign to remove the Navajo from their homeland. Fields were destroyed, orchards were burned, a people was starved into submission. Then they were marched, 300 miles on foot in winter, to a place called Bosque Redondo in eastern New Mexico. Thousands of Navajo made this march. Hundreds died on the way. More died in the camp at Bosque Redondo, from disease, from starvation, from despair. 4 years later, in 1868, the Navajo signed a treaty with the United States, one of the few treaties in American history that allowed an indigenous people to return to their homeland. The Navajo went home, back to the canyon country, back to the red rock and the high desert. Why is this relevant to our story? Because the Long Walk was an attempt, conscious or not, to sever the Navajo from everything that made them Navajo, from their land, from their ceremonial sites, from the landscape that their names and their stories had made into a living archive of who they were. They survived it. They came home. A people who had already survived a 2,000-mile migration across a continent, who had survived the transformation from subarctic hunters to desert farmers, who had survived centuries of contact and adaptation. They survived the Long Walk too. The resilience wasn't accidental. It was built into the inheritance. It was in the language and the ceremony and the deep structural understanding of what it means to be a people in motion, a people who have always had to adapt without losing themselves. This is the point in the video where I want to recommend something. If this story has moved you, If you want to go deeper into the history of Navajo peoples, into the science of ancient DNA, into the archaeology of indigenous migrations, there is a resource that pulls all of this together in one place. The link is in the description. Take a look. But stay, because what comes next is the part of this story that most people never hear. Every migration has a reason. People don't leave home because they want to. They leave because something pushes them. Something makes staying impossible, or makes going necessary, or makes the risk of the unknown smaller than the certainty of the known. We've established that the ancestral Navajo and Apache left the subarctic forests of northern Canada roughly 1,000 years ago. We've established where they went and how we know they went there. But we haven't asked the hardest question. Why? What happened around the year 1000 of the Common Era, in the forests and river valleys of what is now northern Canada, that set an entire people in motion, that sent them walking south on a journey that would take generations to complete? The answer is climate. And the answer is more specific and more dramatic than most people realize. Around the year 900 to 1000 of the Common Era, the Earth's climate shifted. Not catastrophically, not in the way a volcanic eruption shifts things, or an asteroid. Gradually. But the gradient was steep enough, and the consequences severe enough, to reorganize human populations across the entire northern hemisphere. This period is called the medieval warm period. In Europe, it's associated with the expansion of Viking settlements, the flourishing of agriculture in previously marginal zones, the growth of cities. The warming was real, and its effects in the temperate zones were largely positive. But climate is not uniform. What warms one place can destabilize another. And in the subarctic, in the boreal forest zone of northern Canada, the medieval warm period didn't simply bring warmth, it brought disruption. Specifically, it disrupted the caribou. Here's something you need to understand about the relationship between Athabaskan peoples and caribou. It was not simply a food relationship. It was not simply a matter of hunting an animal for meat. The caribou was the organizing principle of subarctic Athabaskan life. The entire annual cycle, where you went, when you went, how you organized your social groups, how you managed your territory, was built around the caribou migration. Caribou move. They move in enormous herds, following seasonal patterns, traveling hundreds of miles between summer and winter ranges. The Athabaskan peoples had, over thousands of years, developed an intimate knowledge of these patterns. They knew where the herds would be in spring, in summer, in fall. They knew the crossing points on the rivers. They knew the mountain passes the herds used. This knowledge was not written down. It was held in the community, passed from elder to young hunter, encoded in oral tradition and practical experience, accumulated over generations. When the climate shifted during the medieval warm period, the caribou patterns shifted with it. The herds moved. Not permanently. Caribou patterns are resilient over the very long term, but enough, and for long enough, to cause serious disruption to communities that depended on them. Imagine the scenario. You are an Athabaskan community in northern Canada, around the year 1000. Your fathers and grandfathers knew exactly where the caribou would cross the river in October. That knowledge was as reliable as the sunrise. And now, for the second or third year running, the herd hasn't come, or has come smaller, or has shifted its route by 50 miles, too far for your community to intercept in time. You are not starving yet, but you are watching the margin disappear. And you know, because you are a people who read the land with extraordinary precision, that the land is telling you something has changed. There is another factor, possibly related to the climate shift, possibly independent. Around the same period, the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, there is archaeological evidence of increased intergroup conflict across the subarctic. Competition for territory, competition for the resources that were becoming less predictable, less reliable. The bow and arrow, which had been spreading through North American populations for several centuries, was now widespread. Conflict had become more lethal. Communities under resource stress had less tolerance for neighbors. The subarctic was getting crowded, not in absolute terms, but in the terms that matter for survival. Too many people competing for resources that were behaving in unfamiliar ways. This combination, climate disruption affecting the caribou, Increased competition for territory, resource stress pushing communities to their margins, created the conditions for a large-scale population movement, not an overnight decision, not a single leader saying, "We go south." A gradual drift, a series of small decisions made by individual families and small groups, each one choosing to move a little further south than before, following rumors of better land, better game, less conflict. Over generations, those small decisions added up to a migration. Now here's where it gets fascinating from a human perspective. The people who moved south were not the weakest. They were not the desperate remnant, the failures who couldn't make it in the north. If anything, they were the most adaptive, the most willing to take risk, the most capable of holding their cultural core stable while everything around them changed. Because what they did, moving into a completely foreign landscape and surviving, then thriving, required exactly the qualities that the subarctic had spent thousands of years selecting for: flexibility, resourcefulness, the ability to read an unfamiliar environment and extract what it offered, the ability to learn from neighbors without being absorbed by them. The subarctic is an extraordinary school. It teaches you, in the most direct possible terms, that rigidity gets you killed, that the environment will change and you must change with it, or die. The people who crossed the Rocky Mountain corridors and arrived in the Southwest 1,000 years ago had been trained by 10,000 years of subarctic living. They were, in a very real sense, the most adaptable human beings on the continent. And the Southwest, with its drought cycles, its unpredictable rainfall, its delicate balance between fertility and desert, rewarded exactly those qualities. Let's talk about what the journey south actually looked like. The most likely migration route, reconstructed from archaeology, from geographic logic, from the distribution of early Athabaskan sites, runs through the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains, not over the high peaks, through the foothills and the river valleys on the eastern side, where game was available, where water was accessible, where the terrain was difficult but passable. This route has been used by human populations for thousands of years. It's the same general pathway that the first Americans used when they moved south after crossing Beringia. Geography tends to funnel movement through the same passes, the same river valleys, generation after generation. The journey was not quick. We are not talking about a single group of people walking from Canada to Arizona in a season. We are talking about a multi-generational process. A community moves south 100 miles, establishes itself, learns the new environment, and then, a generation or two later, part of that
And that,
community
my
moves
friends, is
further
how the
south.
hummingbird got its
Leapfrog
colors.
migration.
You see, the
The same
forest
pattern
holds
has
many
been
secrets
documented
for
in
those
multiple
patient
human
enough to
migrations
listen.
across the world. Small groups moving ahead, establishing footholds, creating pathways for those who follow. Along the way, they encountered other peoples, the Plains peoples, the various nations of the Great Plains, who had their own long histories in the grassland environment. Some of those encounters were peaceful: trade, intermarriage, exchange of knowledge. Some were not. The early Athabaskan migrants moving south were skilled hunters in a landscape full of bison. They had the technology, the bow, the dog, the sophisticated hunting strategies developed in the subarctic to compete effectively in the plains environment. They were not overwhelmed by what they encountered. They adapted to it, used it, moved through it. And then they hit the Southwest, and everything changed again. The desert is not the subarctic. The desert does not forgive the same mistakes. Water is not everywhere. It is in specific places, and knowing those places is the difference between life and death. The heat is as dangerous as the cold in different ways. The game is different, the plants are different, the seasonal rhythms are different. But here is what the subarctic had taught the migrating Athabaskans. Pay attention. Watch. Learn. Find the people who already know this land and learn from them without losing yourself. The Pueblo peoples were there, ancient, settled, sophisticated. They had been managing the desert for thousands of years. They knew where the water was. They knew how to plant corn in soil that barely looked capable of supporting life. They knew the seasonal patterns, the ceremonial cycles tied to the agricultural year. The arriving Athabaskans watched and learned and integrated. This is what the archaeology shows. Not conflict, or not only conflict, coexistence, exchange, a long, complicated, multi-generational negotiation between newcomers and established peoples, in which both sides gave and took and changed. The Navajo that emerged from this process was something new under the sun, a subarctic people who had learned desert farming, northern hunters who had mastered canyon country, a Nardene language wrapped around a southwestern ceremonial life that incorporated both inherited northern elements and learned southern ones. This synthesis, this extraordinary cultural creativity, is what I want you to take away from this part of the story, because it's easy to look at the Navajo today and see a southwestern people. The canyon country, the turquoise jewelry, the sand painting, the hogan against the red rock. It all looks indigenous to the Southwest. It looks like it grew from that soil, and in a sense it did. The Navajo made the Southwest their own, completely and irreversibly. But underneath it, in the language, in the deep structure of the worldview, in the genetic signature, in the ceremonial practices that stretch back beyond the migration, is the subarctic, is the boreal forest, is the caribou and the frozen river and the long dark winter. The Navajo carry the North with them. They always have. Dane, Dine, the people. Same word, same inheritance, same remarkable human capacity to move across a continent and arrive somewhere completely different and make it home. If you want to go deeper into these connections, into the full genetic and linguistic story of Nardene peoples, I've linked a resource in the description that brings together everything covered in this series and more. Link in the description. But stay, because the final part of this story brings everything together in a way I think will genuinely surprise you. We started with a word. Dane. Dine. The people. Same word, spoken in two places so far apart that most people would never think to connect them. A frozen river valley in the Yukon. A red rock canyon in Arizona. Two elders, two fires, two worlds, and one word that means the same thing in both. We followed that word through 6 layers of evidence: language, DNA, oral tradition, archaeology, climate science, migration routes. Every layer said the same thing. These are not two peoples. They are one people, separated by time and distance, carrying the same inheritance in different landscapes. Now I want to tell you what that means. Not just as history, not just as science, as a human story, as something that matters right now, today, in the 21st century. In 2015, something happened that almost nobody outside of indigenous academic circles noticed. A group of Navajo scholars and a group of Dean scholars from the Northwest Territories of Canada began a formal collaborative research project. The explicit purpose of the project was to document, compare, and preserve the shared linguistic and cultural heritage of Nardene peoples across the geographic divide. They already knew they were connected. The science had confirmed what the elders had always said. But knowing it academically and living it, making it real, making it actionable, are different things. What the scholars found when they sat down together and began comparing notes was both moving and urgent. Both communities were experiencing the same crisis: language death. The Nardene languages, all 40 plus of them, from the Alaskan Athabaskan tongues to Navajo to the various Dine languages of Canada, are endangered, most of them critically so. Navajo is the largest Nardene language in terms of speakers. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 people speak Navajo today, making it the most widely spoken indigenous language in the United States. That sounds substantial. Until you look at the age distribution. The overwhelming majority of fluent Navajo speakers are over the age of 50. The language is not being transmitted to children at the rate needed to sustain it. The boarding school era, the systematic removal of Native American children from their homes and communities, the punishment of children for speaking their languages, did precisely what it was designed to do. It broke the intergenerational chain. Among the Northern Dean languages, the situation is often worse. Some Dean languages have fewer than 100 fluent speakers remaining. A few have fewer than 20. Some have already crossed the threshold beyond which revival becomes practically impossible. The last fluent speakers are elderly, and the community structures that would support transmission have been dismantled. When a language dies, what dies with it? Everything we've talked about in this video. The deep grammar that encodes a worldview. The place names that are compressed moral histories. the ceremonial vocabulary that holds the relationship between people and land, the way of naming the world that the Na-Dene peoples carried from Siberia across Beringia, through the subarctic, down the Rocky Mountain corridors, into the desert southwest, carried for 10,000 years across one of the most extraordinary human journeys in the history of our species. All of it encoded in language, all of it at risk. Here is the free, concrete thing you can do right now. If you are interested in supporting the survival of Na-Dene languages, there are active, functioning resources that need nothing from you but your attention. The Endangered Languages Project, a Google-supported initiative, maintains documentation of Na-Dene languages, including audio recordings of elders, written materials, and links to active revitalization programs. It is free, it is publicly accessible. You can listen to Dene languages being spoken. You can hear what 10,000 years of human inheritance sounds like. The Navajo Nation's own language revitalization programs publish materials online. There are Navajo language learning apps. There are YouTube channels run by Navajo speakers teaching the language, one word at a time, to anyone in the world who wants to learn. That's the free solution. That's the starting point. Awareness, attention, amplification. But awareness is only part of the system. The deeper work, the documentation of oral traditions, the training of language teachers, the development of curriculum, the support of immersion programs for children, the archiving of elder knowledge before it is lost, that work requires sustained resources, sustained community infrastructure, sustained institutional support. If you want to find organizations doing that deeper work and find out how to support it, I've linked a resource in the description that maps the landscape, which programs are active, which communities have the most urgent need, where engagement makes the most difference. Link is in the description. But stay, because what I'm about to tell you is the part of this story that puts everything else in perspective. Here is the thing that I cannot stop thinking about. The Navajo Code Talkers. During the Second World War, the United States military recruited Navajo men to serve as communications specialists. The reason, the Navajo language was unknown outside Navajo communities. It had never been written down in any systematic form accessible to outsiders. Its grammar was so complex, so unlike any European or Asian language, that it was considered effectively unbreakable as a code. 421 Navajo men served as code talkers. They transmitted military communications, troop movements, tactical orders, intelligence, in a language that Japanese cryptographers, despite their considerable skill, never cracked. The Navajo language, the Na-Dene inheritance, the deep grammar that arrived in the Americas perhaps 10,000 years ago from Siberia, that survived the migration south, that survived centuries of contact and adaptation, that survived the boarding schools and the long walk. That language helped win the war in the Pacific. The United States government spent decades trying to eradicate the Navajo language, and then it used that same language to protect American soldiers from the greatest military threat the country had faced. The irony is almost too large to hold. But here's what it tells us. The Na-Dene linguistic inheritance is not simply a cultural artifact. It is not simply a piece of heritage to be preserved in a museum or a database. It is a living system of extraordinary complexity and sophistication, complex enough to defeat the best military cryptographers in the world. That complexity didn't appear out of nowhere. It was built, over thousands of years, by human beings adapting an inherited linguistic system to new environments, new challenges, new ways of being in the world. It is one of humanity's great intellectual achievements, and it is disappearing. Let me bring this home. We live in a world that is very good at remembering certain kinds of things. We have libraries, databases, archives, cloud servers. We have more information storage capacity than any civilization in human history. And yet we are losing, right now, in real time, knowledge systems that no library can fully capture. Because language is not just a list of words, it is a way of perceiving, a way of organizing reality, a lens through which a people has looked at the world for thousands of years and found patterns that other lenses miss. The Dene and Navajo relationship to land, the way of reading a landscape through named places,
The land
through stories
remembers
attached to
everything.
specific
My
geography,
grandfather
through a
taught me
moral
that the
framework
mesas
that
hold
sees
our
human
history
beings as
if we only
participants in a web
listen.
of relationships rather than owners of a resource. That is not just culturally interesting, it is practically relevant. In an era of climate crisis, of ecological disruption, of landscapes behaving in unfamiliar ways, the kind of knowledge that Navajo peoples have accumulated over millennia of close attention to their environments is exactly the kind of knowledge that the world needs more of, not less. The subarctic Dean noticed, in their oral traditions, that the climate had changed before, that the land had behaved differently in a previous era, that the patterns their grandparents knew had shifted, and they adapted, they survived, and in some cases they moved. We are in another period of climate disruption. The land is behaving in unfamiliar ways again, and the peoples whose inherited knowledge systems are best equipped to read that disruption, to notice the early signals, to remember what previous disruptions looked like, to adapt without losing their core, are precisely the peoples whose languages and traditions are most at risk of disappearing. The loss is not abstract, it is practical. It is urgent. Here is what I want to leave you with. A single word traveled 10,000 years. From the steppes of Siberia, across a land bridge that no longer exists, through the subarctic forests of North America, down through the Rocky Mountain corridors, into the desert southwest. It survived glaciers and migrations and cultural upheavals and colonial violence and deliberate erasure. Dine, the people. That word is still being spoken. Right now, today. By elders in the Yukon and grandmothers in Arizona and young people in language classes who are choosing, deliberately and against considerable odds, to carry it forward. That word, and everything it carries, is the most durable human artifact I know of. More durable than any pyramid, any manuscript, any monument. Because it lives in human mouths, in human memory, in the human capacity to say, this is who we are, this is where we came from, this is what we carry. The connection that shouldn't exist, that crosses 2,000 miles and 1,000 years and seems impossible
Hello,
until
can you
you
hear
look at
me?
the evidence,
We need
is not a
backup at
mystery
Sector 4
anymore.
immediately.
It's a
The
family.
resistance is stronger
And
than
families,
expected.
when they remember each other, are harder to erase than anyone expects. Drop a number in the comments, 1, 2, or 3. 1. If the linguistic connection hit you hardest. The idea that the same word survived 10,000 years across a continent. 2. If the DNA story was the moment it became real for you. The genetics confirming what the elders already knew. 3. If the code talker's story reframed everything. The language that defeated military cryptographers being the same language the government tried to destroy. 1, 2, or 3. Tell me which moment landed, and this one matters. Forward this video to one person you know who teaches. A history teacher, a science teacher, a parent who homeschools, a professor. Anyone who stands in front of students and tells them stories about where human beings come from. Because this story is not in the standard curriculum. It is not in most textbooks. The connection between the Dene and the Navajo, the language, the DNA, the migration, the code talkers, most students never hear it. One forward from you changes that for at least one classroom, and one classroom is where it starts. Next week, we go somewhere that will challenge everything you think you know about the peopling of the Americas. Because there is a site in South America, a site with a name most people can't pronounce, and a history that most archaeologists spent decades trying to explain away, that pushes the arrival of humans in the Americas back by thousands of years beyond what the standard model allows. And there is an internal memo from a major American university archaeology department, dated 1986, that shows the senior researchers knew about the anomalous dating and made a deliberate decision about how to handle it. Next week, you won't want to miss it.